Hi, I'm Winston Purchase, President of Local Branch 1870 Downers Grove. I am currently in leadership class number 24. I am doing a project on the Great Migration and the effect it had on labor and society in Illinois prior to the Great Depression. The Great Migration, also known as the Great Northward Migration, was the movement of African Americans from the southern rural states, mainly Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and Louisiana, to the urban Midwest and Northeast. They were in search of jobs, fair pay, or the acquisition of property. My job is to show the rich labor history of Illinois, including the good, the bad, and ugly. The Great Migration started in the early 20th century, and there were two places that stood out for the Southern blacks to migrate to: Harlem in the Northeast and Chicago in the Midwest. But in much of the Deep South, it was Chicago that captured the attention of the Southern black Americans. No matter where they came from or where they stopped, the Mecca was Chicago. These African Americans were fleeing the South, where there were unfavorable terms of trade, unequal distribution of income and property, and the pressures of rural poverty. At the same time, while fleeing these conditions, they were trying to get to the North, where they could get employment, fair pay, and they could acquire their own property, as well as live near loved ones that had previously moved north. Another reason Chicago was a hot destination was the Defender, a Chicago-based black newspaper which was started in 1905. When Carl Sandburg was a reporter for the Chicago Daily News, he once wrote, "The Defender, more than any other one agency, was the big cause of the Northern fever and the big exodus from the South." The United States Labor Department said that in some sections of the country, the Defender was probably more effective carrying off labor than all agents put together. By the peak of the Great Migration, the weekly circulation was estimated at 250,000 copies, with the large majority of the copies being circulated south of the Mason-Dixon line. The Defender showed the advantages of living in the North and the disadvantages of living in the South. In other words, the Defender showed the promises of living the American dream in the North and sometimes portrayed as the land of hope. The Defender also advertised household goods like phonographs with free records to go with, and stores advertised layaway plans on dresses, coats, fancy suits, fur coats, and plush coats. This was a way that you could pay on goods that you could not normally afford. Also, the Defender advertised cosmetics, with Madam C.J. Walker being their largest client, advertising her straightening comb and skin lightener, which was consumed by both men and women. Cosmetics were considered a luxury that they did not have access to in the rural South. The Southern blacks saw through reading the Defender that migrating north was a way to have these things they could not attain living in the South. The Defender told of all the black-owned businesses in Chicago and how African Americans had acquired wealth through hard work and perseverance. Also, how the blacks achieved a level of respect and prestige that was unheard of in the South. So in short, with the promise of a job market and a chance at the American dream that was being published through the Defender newspaper, it attracted the blacks in the South to migrate north to Chicago. Everything was not all roses in the North. There was a series of riots and massacres that took place starting with the Springfield riot of 1908. When the blacks started migrating north, Springfield, Illinois was one of the train stops on the Illinois Central Railroad, which went from New Orleans to Chicago. Springfield, Illinois was a rapidly growing industrial center where some of the blacks sought refuge and prosperity. In 1908, Springfield's population included slightly more than 1,000 black men in its workforce. About 50% of them were porters and laborers, and only 150 black men were employed as miners to work in the coal mines. The rest of them were restricted to lower class and unskilled jobs. The blacks generally lived in the racially segregated neighborhoods of the Levee and the Badlands. Realtors used restrictive covenants that prevented blacks from purchasing property elsewhere. There was a big influx of immigrants in Springfield, and they were competing against the blacks for jobs. Yet the immigrants were not accepted by the native white Americans either. About 35% of the immigrants could not speak English, and 15% were illiterate. White Americans were increasingly more negative and fearful towards the immigrants, who they deemed to be inferior and culturally and religiously odd. They also found the immigrants to generally be substandard with proclivity to filth, laziness, and violence. Within the country's hierarchy, European immigrants were below whites but above the blacks. This provided the immigrants with a choice, either become socially white or align with politically and economically disadvantaged blacks. The immigrants opted to try and become white. As social tensions rose due to the swelling immigrant population and the decrease in job stability, resentment among white immigrants ran high against blacks. This is where the labor aspect comes in. White business owners often exploited this resentment for their own economic benefit. Some industries used black workers as strike breakers during labor strikes, pitting blacks and immigrants against each other in an effort to prevent unionization. So the business had tapped into an almost inexhaustible supply of cheap labor and an even greater resistance to unionization through racial antagonism. With racial tensions at a high, all that was needed was an excuse to harm the blacks. Then it happened. A white lady accused a colored man of raping her. Even though the accused had several witnesses that put him somewhere else, he was taken into custody for the crime. A mob of whites numbering between 3,000 and 5,000 went to the jail to try to get the man and lynch him. The man, along with another man that was accused of murder, had been moved to a jail in Bloomington, so they were not there. This angered the mob even more so. The mob moved to the black neighborhood known as the Levee, chanting, "Curse the day that Lincoln freed the niggers. No niggers in Springfield, and kill them on sight." The mob torched and destroyed all the black businesses, and the blacks that they found they beat in the streets. When they entered the other black neighborhood, they burned the entire neighborhood, even forcing some of the blacks to stay and burn up in their own houses. When all was said and done, the man accused of the rape was released, and the victim had recanted her story, telling the truth that her husband had beat her because she was having an affair with another white man. In the aftermath, the immigrants aligned themselves with the dominant social class whites through their skin color, which in America superseded nationality, culture, and religion. Ultimately, Springfield's whites attacked the city's blacks simply because they could. As a direct result of the attacks, concerned black and white citizens met in New York City to discuss and address racism and white supremacy in the United States. They formed the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, a civil rights organization. In 1917, there was another riot, this time in East St. Louis. The East St. Louis race riot was a labor and race-related riot. It was estimated to have over 250 deaths and caused what would be, in today's market, over $8 million in damages, and over 6,000 blacks were left homeless. The United States had a good economy at the time, and many workers were drafted or enlisted into the military to fight in World War I. There were major industries in East St. Louis, including the Aluminum Ore Company, American Steel Foundry, Republic Iron and Steel, Aubert Nestor Glass, and Elliott Frog and Switch Company. A frog was part of a railroad switch. Nearby National City was home of the stockyards and meatpacking plants. When industries became embroiled in labor strikes, the traditionally white unions sought to strengthen their bargaining power by excluding or hindering the black workers. But industry owners hired blacks as strikebreakers. The groups competed economically to survive, and white workers feared they would be undercut by black workers accepting lower wages. In 1916, 2,500 white workers at the meatpacking plant near East St. Louis went out on strike for higher wages. The companies imported black workers to replace them. Ultimately, they received their wage increase, but 800 workers lost their jobs when the company kept 800 of the black workers that were hired when the white workers went out on strike. In May of 2017, the workers at the Aluminum Ore Company went out on strike. The company replaced them with hundreds of blacks. Then, after the striking workers had a labor meeting, an estimated 1,000 to 3,000 white men marched into downtown East St. Louis and started attacking African Americans on the street and in streetcars. The governor sent in the National Guard, and tensions eased for a while. After the East St. Louis Labor Council ordered an investigation by the State Council of Defense, the council reported that Southern Negroes were misled by false advertisement and unscrupulous employment agents to come to East St. Louis under false pretenses of secure jobs and decent living quarters. The tensions between the black and white workers quickly formed again as there was no solution to the problem. Struggling for decent wages, the white workers feared the black workers would take their jobs for less pay. A car with white men in it was driving through a black neighborhood and fired several shots into a crowd. A few hours later, the same type of car carrying a reporter and a couple of police officers came through the same neighborhood, and the blacks, thinking it was the same car, fired shots into the car, killing one officer and wounding the other. A few hours later, the same type of car carrying a reporter and a couple of police officers came through the same neighborhood, and the blacks, thinking it was the same car, fired shots into the car, killing one officer and wounding the other. The next day, thousands of white spectators were viewing the blood-stained automobile, and they rushed into the black section of town and started rioting. They beat and shot blacks indiscriminately, including women and children. After cutting the hoses of the fire department, white rioters burned entire sections of the city and shot the blacks as they tried to escape. They even hung some of the blacks as they caught them. The governor ordered the National Guard in, and they arrived on the third day of the riots. Numerous witnesses said the National Guard initially joined in the attacks on the blacks rather than stopping it. The death toll was inconclusive because many of the bodies were burned in the fires and some were dumped in the river. Only the bodies that went through the coroner and the funeral homes were accounted for. Property damage was excessive. 6,000 blacks were left homeless after their neighborhoods had been burned. The Southern Railway warehouse was burned with 100 carloads of merchandise in them, estimated at over $500,000. The ferocious brutality of the attacks and the failure of the authorities to protect innocent lives led to the radicalization of many blacks in the St. Louis area and throughout the nation. Marcus Garvey declared in a speech he gave right after the massacre that the riot was one of the bloodiest outrages against mankind and a wholesale massacre of our people. In New York City, the NAACP arranged a silent march down Fifth Avenue in protest of the riots. 10,000 blacks marched in the silent parade with the women and children dressed in white and the men dressed in black. The Chicago race riots of 1919, like the other race riots, were committed by ethnic white Americans against blacks. The riots lasted over a week. The socio-political atmosphere of Chicago was one of ethnic tension caused by the competition among many new groups. With the Great Migration, thousands of African Americans from the South had settled next to neighborhoods of European immigrants on Chicago's South Side, near jobs in the stockyards and the meatpacking plants. The Irish had been established first, and they fiercely defended their territory and political power against all newcomers. Unlike southern cities at the time, Chicago did not segregate most public accommodations. According to Walter Francis White of the NAACP, Chicago had a good reputation for equitable treatment of African Americans. However, unofficially, early 20th century beaches were racially segregated. Note the riot started when an African American teenager raft drifted into a white section of the beach, and he was stoned and knocked in the water and drowned. When the white police arrived, they did not arrest the white person that was throwing the stones, but instead arrested an African American for a less serious crime. By 1910, thousands of African Americans were moving from the South to Chicago as a major destination in the Great Migration to industrial cities, fleeing lynchings, segregation, and disenfranchisement in the Deep South. With industrial jobs in the stockyards and the meatpacking industry opening as European immigration was cut off by World War I, from 1916 to 1919, the African American population in Chicago increased from 44,000 to 109,000, a 148% increase during that period. The growing African American population settling in the South Side bordered a neighborhood of Irish Americans existing since the mid-19th century, and the two groups competed for jobs and housing. There were competition and tensions in their relationships, as well as ethnic groups were possessive of their neighborhoods. During the post-war period, veterans of all groups were looking to re-enter the workforce. Some whites resented that African American veterans. At the same time, African American veterans exhibited greater militancy and pride as a result of having served to protect their country. They expected to be treated as full citizens after fighting for their country. During the riot, most industry was closed and 38 people died, 23 African American and 15 white, and another 537 were injured, with 2/3 of them African American. Approximately 1,000 residents were left homeless, mostly African American, because of the fires. After the riot, management banned African American employees from returning to work in the stockyards in fear of further rioting. Governor Loudon noted in his opinion that the troubles were related to labor, whereas 2/3 of the African Americans were non-union and they were resented by the union employees for that reason. 5 days after the riots had ended, 3,000 non-union African Americans showed up for work under protection of special police, deputy sheriffs, and militia. The white union employees threatened to strike unless such security forces were discontinued. Their main grievance against African Americans was that they were non-union and had been used by management as strikebreakers. Another one of the jobs that the migrating Southern African Americans were employed as was that of a porter. The Pullman Company was one of the largest single employers of African Americans, and Pullman had created an image for itself of enlightened benevolence via financial support for black churches, newspapers, and other organizations. It also paid many porters well enough to enjoy the advantages of middle-income lifestyles and prominence within their own communities. Working for the Pullman Company was, however, less glamorous in practice than it appeared. Porters depended on tips for much of their income and thus on the generosity of white passengers who often referred to all porters as George, the first name of George Pullman, the company's founders. Porters were almost exclusively black, and this practice was believed to have come from the old custom of naming their slaves after their master, and in this case, George Pullman. Porters were required to travel 11,000 miles, nearly 400 hours per month, to earn a basic wage. In 1934, porters on regular assignments worked an average of over 73 hours per week and earned 27.8 cents an hour, while workers in manufacturing jobs averaged 37 hours per week and earned an average of 54.8 cents per hour. The porters spent roughly 10% of the time in unpaid preparatory and terminal setup and cleanup duties. The porters paid for their own food, lodging, and uniforms, which could consume up to half their wages. The porters were also charged whenever their passengers stole a towel or a water pitcher. Porters were not eligible for promotion to conductor, a job reserved for whites, despite frequently performing the conductor duties. At the time when the porters formed their union, Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the African American community was estranged from organized labor. While the American Federation of Labor nominally did not exclude black workers, many of its affiliates did. Many black workers saw their employer, whether it was Henry Ford in Detroit or Swift Packing in Chicago, as more sympathetic to them than either their white co-workers or the labor movement. In addition, the economic separation, deprivation, and marginalization of the black community forced by Jim Crow and the doctrine of advancement through self-reliance preached by Booker T. Washington led many black leaders to look with distrust on joining with whites on issues of common concern, and often denied the blacks and whites had any common interests at all. Furthermore and foremost, white supremacy remained entrenched in most every institution that existed in the United States, and these racist beliefs, both subtle and overt, precluded the white labor movement from recognizing black workers or the organized fronts. As early as 1900, efforts were put forth by various collectives of Pullman porters to organize the porters into a union, each effort having been crushed by Pullman. In 1925, A. Philip Randolph was invited by Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters union organizer Ashley Totten to address the porters in New York City. With Randolph exhibiting a sound understanding of the plight of the black worker and the need for a genuine labor union, Randolph was asked to undertake the job of organizing the porters into a bona fide labor union. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was launched on the night of August 25, 1925. Key to the success of the union was to galvanize membership by way of a national membership drive, with three of Pullman terminals being most important: Chicago, Oakland, and St. Louis. The man to see in Chicago was Milton Price Webster. Webster was a porter for over 20 years and was fired for attempting to organize the porters. Webster was a man of strong convictions and was well connected throughout the Chicago politic. Webster was a stalwart backroom negotiator, and he captured his audience with his command of the subject, his keen wit and sharp intellect, and his commitment to alleviating the struggles of the working man. The Pullman Company started their own company union, the Pullman Porters and Maids Protective Association, to represent their loyal employees. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters continued to fight the Pullman Company and its allies in the black community, which were bought, the white power structure, and rival unions in the AFL, American Federation of Labor, that were hostile to its members' job claims. The porters tried involving the federal government in its fight with the Pullman Company. In 1927, the Brotherhood filed a case with the ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission, requesting an investigation of Pullman rates, porters' wages, tipping practices, and other matters related to wages and working conditions. The ICC ruled they did not have jurisdiction. In 1928, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porter leaders decided that the only way to force the issue was to go on strike. Randolph was hoping the threat of a strike would give the porters leverage to get the federal NMB, National Mediation Board, established pursuant to the Railway Labor Act to bring the Pullman Company to the table while mobilizing support from supporters outside the industry. After the Pullman Company secretly met with the NMB refused to follow precedent it had set in the case of a group of white railroad workers and refused to act on behalf of the Brotherhood. The National Mediation Board argued that the Brotherhood was incapable of disrupting the Pullman sleeping car service. Although the union had voted to strike, the Pullman Company had convinced the NMB that the union did not have in numbers or the resources to pull it off. Randolph called the strike off just hours before it was to begin, recognizing that a strike would have crippled the Brotherhood. In 1934, the Roosevelt administration amended the Railroad Labor Act and passed the Wagner-Connery Act, which outlawed company unions and covered porters. The Brotherhood then defeated the company union in 1935 in an election held by the National Mediation Board, and the porters were certified. In 1936, the American Federation of Labor granted the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters an international charter. In 1937, the Brotherhood requested the assistance of the National Mediation Board, and a contract between the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was signed, raising the wages of the porters and maids, establishing a basic 240-hour a month, and providing time and a half overtime pay after 260 hours. The company also agreed to pay for the uniforms of the porters after they'd been employed for 10 years. The union had persevered and overcame many roadblocks, but they finally got the recognition and a negotiated contract that they had fought for 12 long, hard years to get. Illinois has a rich labor history dating back to the Haymarket Riots, which is considered to be the most influential event in the history of labor in Illinois, the United States, and even the world. But there was some more fighting that took place in Illinois during the Great Migration that had great ramifications on where we are today. In conclusion, I tried to show the good, the bad, the ugly of the Great Migration. There were many setbacks, with the race riots in Springfield, Illinois in 1908, East St. Louis in 1917, and Chicago in 1919. The tensions from the riots all had something to do with the Southern blacks migrating north in search of a better life through jobs. Once the rioting was over, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, an all-black union, was formed and eventually received recognition in the American Federation of Labor. As a direct result of the riot in Springfield, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was formed. A. Philip Randolph, the founder and first president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, went on to become a great leader in the civil rights movement, and he was the organizer of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963, where Dr. Martin Luther King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech.